All right, students. So this week we begin the jazz movement called cool jazz. Now, cool jazz came out in the 1950s, and there were actually two major jazz movements that started in the 1950s, and cool jazz was the first of these. Next week we'll get to the second one. So, what we got with cool jazz in the 1950s, the culture and society in America was really changing a lot. It was a post-war culture, post World War II, and actually the people started listening to less and less jazz, and listening went to other directions. And actually, people started listening to rock and roll, the early '50s rock and roll, and it was definitely a time of affluence with the baby boomers in the suburbs and a strong economy from World War II. And there were some not so good things going in it, which we'll get to next week. But you will see that when we compare and contrast next week's jazz. So the good stuff from the decade was the affluence, the idea that Americans were doing very well in a post-war economy, and especially for white Americans, they were doing super well. You know, suburbs built up, families had a lot of economic prosperity, and of course, there were cool things like television that came out. Now, cool jazz was a reaction against the frantic, agitated bebop style. Bebop was great for musicians, but not a lot of non jazz listeners could get into it. So these jazz musicians wanted to take things another direction, wanted to maybe get back an audience for jazz. So the melodies became simpler than these complicated bebop melodies. Um, the volume levels were low. It was very relaxed feeling. Definitely less frantic than bebop. When people were playing solos, they weren't striving for this instrumental virtuosity, so the solos were more relaxed. It was a very dry instrumental tone, which means the musicians were trying to avoid like this roughness and maybe a little bit of avoid some funkiness to the music. So a nice, straight, dry tone. Some of the cool jazz musicians with their groups, they would arrange little sections, either work out harmonies between the horns or some interesting sections, maybe key changes or things like that. Whereas the beboppers, it was all about just let's just get right in and just start soloing. And cool jazz became known as West Coast jazz, because it was based mostly in California, specifically Los Angeles and Hollywood, and it was mostly white musicians that were attracted to this music of cool jazz. Now, some great cool jazz musicians that you'll be listening to this week. Chet Baker, a great trumpet player. He was known as the James Dean of trumpet. And like Bix Beiderbecke, another young man with a horn. You see him on the left and the right. The left, he looks like a matinee idol. The right is after years and years of heroin addiction. Jerry Mulligan, another West Coast musician, he played the baritone sax. It's a big saxophone, and he led a very popular group in the 1950s. Dave Brubeck, probably one of the most famous musicians to come out of the cool jazz era. His famous Take Five, you'll see that on this week's video assignments. And Miles Davis is the one that really kicked off the movement with the birth of the Cool album. Miles Davis had a particular trumpet style where he wasn't into super high note virtuosity, lots of fast notes. His was a style of a space and understatement. And with the composer Gil Evans, he recorded some major cool jazz albums. Now, we're just going to touch on this album briefly because Miles Davis kind of kicked it off before the white West Coast musicians really took it up. But in a couple of weeks, we'll focus exclusively on Miles Davis and all of the amazing directions he went with jazz. So anyway, I know you're gonna have a lot of good listening this week. Pull up a nice drink and listen to some cool jazz. See you later.